Here are a few of the basic tools that I use when creating a watercolor painting. I like to use some sort of tube paint, and you could do anything from a very inexpensive to a less expensive quality tube paint. You know, try a few out, maybe buy a few tubes at a time, practice a little bit, or you can just get a complete set like this. I've used everything from the tube paints to the dried watercolor paints that come in a tray, and as long as you work with them a little bit and practice, you can do an attractive rendering with any type of watercolor paint. I use a variety of brushes. I try to do some that maybe have a little bit of a chisel point for a fine line, wide brushes, synthetic, horsehair, just a variety of brushes. Even these little sponges work fantastic for doing a watercolor painting. You know, especially if you're doing something like a stipple effect, you want to use the broader tips or the sponge. You could also use the sponge just for laying out a little bit of water on your watercolor paper. Some sort of tray for mixing. This could be just a simple plastic tray like this one. A glass plate, a styrofoam plate work just fine as well. And then I usually have some oil pastels, and those I will use at the very end of the painting, because obviously the oil pastels and the watercolor won't mix. But once the watercolor is dry on your paper, you can use the oil pastels to do some highlight effects with the lighter colors, or to add some darker line work. Once you have your drawing onto your watercolor paper, you can begin illustrating. Now, it's very important as you're learning how to illustrate that you're following some sort of example. For example, maybe you're looking at a photo in a magazine, or you're looking at actual pieces of furniture that you have around your home. We're going to start this drawing with the background, and what we're going to do is we're looking at how the sunlight is going to be coming through these windows. So we're going to do some shaded areas and then leave some areas lighter. So what I want to do is to show you one technique that works very well. Just taking a brush with water, clean water. I'm going to brush it in this area. Just kind of brush the water where I want the paint to go. Now, using the watercolor, I'm going to use a light tan wall, so I'm going to mix a little bit of something like a cadmium yellow with a little bit of a brown. A little more water in there. And then I'm going to apply this to the wet area on the wall. So one of the reasons that I did apply a little bit of water to this area was to try to keep the watercolor from absorbing over into the dry area. Also, it helps in smoothing out the color. So I want to see a little bit of sunshine hitting in this area, so I want to take a little bit of yellow, mix with that, a little bit of water on the brush. Okay, now what I'm going to do, dry my brush off a little bit and go in and actually pull off a little bit of the color. Move it around. I'm going to add a little more yellow. We're not going to see it. The yellow is not going to stand out. Okay, so let's just kind of push the color around a little bit. Now, up here in this corner, we want to see this as a little darker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of violet. Typically speaking, you will see violet and blues mixed with a little bit of black make a very, very nice shadow effect. So again, just going to drop some of that pigment in here. And I'll drop a little more pigment. One of the best things about watercolor is very, very forgiving. You don't have to work overly fast with it, but you certainly can. Alright, so there I've got some nice dark shaded areas. Also with watercolor, again, the forgiving part, if you have something that's too dark, you can go in with a little bit of water, smudge it out. You can create effects very similar as the effects you can create with marker. Right, and you can get some nice dark deep areas, and you can have some areas that are nice and light. Clean my brush a little bit. So always have at least 2 cups of water, one to clean your brush, another to really rinse it off, get some of that color off. Also, a little paper towel if you want to pull a little pigment off. Okay, so you can get some very interesting effects using watercolor. So I'm going to do the same thing to this wall here. It would be very similar to this. This time I'm going to use a dry technique. So I'm just going to go in, dry being not that your paint is dry, but that your paper is dry. So I'm going to go in with a little bit of black, a little bit of brown, a little bit of that yellow ochre. And now we'll see how this works differently than the previous method. So you get a much crisper line with the dry brush than you do with the paper being wet. So you can really come in here, get some crisp lines if you want them. Now, the nice part about this, what I'm going to do, I'm going to rinse my brush. I'm going to go in with mostly water on the brush, and I'm going to smooth this line out a little bit because I don't want it quite so harsh. Okay. And then I'm going to do that one more time. Get a little water on the brush, and I'm going to smooth this out a little bit. And what this does is just blending the color across this particular plane that we're illustrating. I'd like a little darker value in that area, so I'm going to take a little black with a little violet. I'm just going to add it, just going to dab it in. All right, and there you have it. So what we have here is, again, the wet technique. Wet the paper and then apply the color and then move it across the wet areas. And over here, a dry technique. Really depends on what you're used to working with. You could work with both at the same time. You can always go back in and add and change. And again, beautiful thing about watercolor, very forgiving. You can go in and pick up color as needed. All right, so now that we have these 2 walls completed, we want to let the paper dry a little bit. One of the things that you're going to notice about watercolor is you really don't need to use the white pigment if it comes with white. The only time I use white in a watercolor illustration is to add highlight after the fact. So I really won't use any white to mix with the colors, because basically you can mix a color. For example, we will do red on these pieces of furniture, and you know, think about how color works. You can go in with very, very, very intense red. Right, that red needs a little brown in it. This red needs a little bit of brown. So you can go in with the red color that's a pure color, and if you really want to fade the color out with watercolor, you just add water. So let's say that this side's a little bit lighter than the other side. So you could just add water to the color. You don't have to add white to it. Now again, on the top, you know, we're going to see some of the color, we're going to see some white reflection. Get a little bit of red, a little bit of brown. Because I don't want this to look pink when it's completed. Now, and as you have your paper wet, if you really want to get some nice blending effects, you certainly can. So watercolor can be a very, very fast method as well. All right, I'm going to pull a little bit of violet little bit of black. And then I'm going to go in and just kind of hit like some areas that I think might be shaded. Again, it's a very good idea to look at an image of something as you're working and then follow the shading effects that you see on that image based upon how it works with your illustration. Now again, I didn't want quite that much in here, but watercolor is very forgiving. I could dry my brush, go back in, could pull that color back out. Alright, so you can keep playing until you're happy with it. Alright, and we're going to let this dry, and then we're going to add a little more shading. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and mix some more red with brown. And then I'm going to start working on this piece as well. Come in and get some nice pure color. I'm using a dry method here. I want this area to be darker. I'm going to grab a little bit of black, a little bit of violet, create a little bit of an edge there and kind of push that where you can pull it into the drawing. Now if you think of watercolor as an art form, you'll realize that seldom do watercolors have perfectly crisp lines and edging, but you can of course give it as sharp a line as you want or keep it as subtle with as much movement as you want. Alright, so now this is drying a little bit. I'm going to go in and add a little more value to the bottom side. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of red as well. And again, I always have a towel on the side that I could remove some color and dry my brush a little bit. Alright. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep playing with this side. We're using a dry brush again. Dry paper. So brown, red, and let's see, let's work on this back part. Now you're noticing I'm just using one wide brush. You can of course, I do see people very frequently use small brushes, and I see people use the tiny fine point brushes, which I don't think are necessary. With a wide brush like this, you can get the wide strokes that we've been doing. You can go in and you can get a pretty sharp, crisp line. Okay, and anything you want to leave white, try to leave white on the paper as you're doing this. Get a little more black, a little more violet. And get some of those colors over here on the side. Again, to help give a little bit of a shaded effect. Alright, so one thing that's very, very important is don't try to fill in everything with watercolor. You just don't have to do that. I'm going to get a little more water on my brush now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in, let's see, this arm is going to be darker. Because again, light's coming in this way, and we have some probably overhead lighting. So we can make that arm a little bit darker. Okay. Alright, I think I'm going to leave that alone. I think this looks pretty sharp right now. So what we'll do is we'll continue working with this using some little more water. Instead of, again, you don't have to add white, you just add a little more water. And I'm going to just kind of bring some of this color around. I'm going to leave this top of this arm is going to be very light. I'm going to get a little bit of paint off my brush, go in. Alright, and we'll just kind of let those colors merge together a little bit there. I mean, this works really well, especially if this is a tactile. This works really well if this is a textile or a leather. Add a little more red in here since this is drying a little bit. Another thing to think about is as watercolor dries, depends on the brand you're using and how much pigment you're using with your water, but sometimes it will dry darker. Frequently it will dry lighter, and if it does dry lighter, you're going to have to go back and add some more value. Alright, I'm going to go ahead, this is drying now, so I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of value on the bottom parts of this. And over to the sides a little bit. Just trying to model color through. What you really don't want, you don't want just a solid stripe of color, because that becomes a very, very boring illustration. On this top piece, I've got this nice modeling. It looks like light's hitting, but I want a little more pigment. And I don't want it everywhere, just in a few spots. Alright, so again, take the same colors that I've been using. A little bit of water. And I want to start working on this front part. Now I could do each one of these little sections individually, or I could come in and do them as a whole, as we did on one of the other pieces. Right, and that little bit of bleeding is fine. Again, let me dry my brush, and if I want to pull a little color, I could just go in with my brush that's dry, or if I wanted to, I could actually take another brush at this point and go with another brush, move paint around, you know, just kind of keep this brush nice and dry. Okay. Alright, so there we're getting the start, and actually while I've got a little bit of pigment on this brush, I can go ahead and just kind of stipple in a little pigment here, scrape it across that arm, scrape it across the front of that arm, pull a little more pigment, put it up onto the seat. Okay, use my other brush again. I want a little more color up here. Alright, and there you have the start of a watercolor illustration.